Christmas Eve, Black Ridge, 21:47 hours. The church bell rang wrong. Not the clean, resonant tone that should mark the birth of hope, but something cracked and discordant, a sound like bone breaking. The bell tower had taken shrapnel 3 hours earlier, and now it chimed unevenly through the gunfire, marking time in a city where 540 Marines sat trapped in a perfect kill zone. Captain Owen Haleford crouched behind a concrete barrier that had once been part of a municipal building, watching his breath fog the freezing air. 38 years old, 14 years in the Marine Corps, and he had never felt this helpless. The tactical display on his wrist glowed a sickening red, enemy icons forming a complete circle around his scattered battalion. No gaps, no weakness, just a tightening noose of machine gun positions, mortar teams, and disciplined fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. "Sir, 2nd Platoon reports 3 more wounded." Lieutenant Brennan Westbrook's voice carried the thin edge of controlled panic, his hand pressed against his earpiece, face pale in the darkness. "They're pinned in the factory building, can't move." Haleford checked his watch. 6 hours. 6 hours since they'd entered Black Ridge at 15:30 on what intelligence had called a simple humanitarian mission. 200 civilians trapped in the southern district, they'd said. Get them out before the ceasefire talks begin. Should be routine. It wasn't routine. The enemy had let them walk right into the heart of the city, 540 Marines spreading out through 12 buildings to process evacuation sites. Then the trap had closed with mechanical precision. Heavy machine guns opened up from the upper floors. Mortars began raining from the northern ridge. A weaponized commercial drone had swooped down like a hunting falcon and destroyed their command vehicle with a shaped charge, taking their radio repeater and any hope of calling for help. Now they were scattered, bleeding, running low on ammunition, and completely surrounded. The church bell rang again. Time passing, Christmas approaching. Somewhere back home, families were singing carols and wrapping presents. Here, young men were dying in the snow. "Viper 6 to Badger 6. Haleford keyed his radio, keeping his voice steady despite everything. "We are combat ineffective. Multiple casualties. Ammunition at 40%. No safe extraction route. Request immediate close air support." The response took 30 seconds, long enough for Haleford to watch Private Callum Hendricks huddle against a wall 10 meters away, the kid's rifle shaking in his hands. 19 years old, from some small town in Idaho, had been joking about Christmas leave just that morning. "Viper 6, Badger 6. Colonel Victor Thorne's voice came through, and something in its tone made Haleford's stomach drop. "Air support is denied at this time. Political situation. Stand by for further instructions." Haleford stared at the radio like it had just spoken in a foreign language. "Sir, my Marines are dying. I need those birds now." Another pause. Longer this time. "Captain Haleford, you are not a priority tonight. Hold your position. That's an order." The radio went dead. Westbrook was staring at him, eyes wide in the muzzle flash in darkness. "Sir, did they just—" "Yeah," Haleford's voice came out flat. "They did. Abandon." That was the word neither of them would say, but it hung in the frozen air between them like the ghost of every promise the Corps had ever made. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Unless the politics went wrong. Unless some diplomat in a clean suit decided 540 lives were an acceptable sacrifice for a ceasefire photo opportunity. The church bell rang again, marking another minute toward midnight, toward Christmas Day that most of these Marines would never see. But 2,100 meters away, on a partially collapsed rooftop at the northern edge of the city, someone had been listening to every word of that radio conversation, and she was reaching for the seal on her rifle. 72 hours earlier, the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Sentinel had been uncomfortably warm, packed with officers studying maps and satellite imagery. Colonel Victor Thorne stood at the front, A man who carried his 62 years like a well-maintained weapon. His hair was steel gray, his face carved with the kind of lines you only get from watching young men die in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Desert Storm, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. 38 years of service, and he'd learned one fundamental truth. Politicians made decisions. Soldiers paid the price. Humanitarian mission, he was saying, tapping the map of Black Ridge with a laser pointer. Intelligence reports approximately 200 civilians trapped in the Southern District. Battalion strength insertion, process evacuation sites, extract civilians before ceasefire negotiations begin in Geneva. Young officers scribbled notes. Haleford, sitting in the second row, felt that familiar tightness in his gut. Humanitarian missions in active conflict zones had a way of going sideways. Questions? Thorne asked. Sir, what about Overwatch? This from a captain Haleford didn't recognize. That's a lot of urban terrain. Observation Post 7 will provide eyes on the northern approach. Thorne's voice was neutral, but something flickered in his expression. Manned by Captain Elara Kincaid, call sign Frost. A ripple went through the room. Somebody in the back row actually snickered. Thorne's head turned with the precision of a gun turret acquiring a target. Something funny, Lieutenant? The young officer straightened. No, sir, Isn't that the sniper who got court-martialed? The Kandahar incident? Captain Kincaid, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze hydrogen, has 73 confirmed kills, which is more than anyone in this room will ever see, more than most snipers achieve in an entire career. She is quite possibly the finest marksman the Marine Corps has ever produced. He paused, letting that sink in. Show some respect. The room went silent. Haleford studied Thorne's face and saw something there. Not just anger at disrespect, something deeper. A kind of quiet determination that suggested the colonel knew more about this mission than he was saying. After the briefing, Haleford lingered, watching through the window as Thorne walked across the compound toward the armory building. The colonel moved with the careful economy of a man whose body had taken too many hits, but refused to show weakness. Inside the armory's preparation room, a woman sat at a workbench, breaking down a rifle with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for defusing bombs. Captain Elara Kincaid was 35 years old and looked like someone had carved her from winter itself. Sharp features, pale skin, dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands moved over the rifle components with absolute certainty, checking, cleaning, reassembling. The weapon was a .338 Lapua Magnum, one of the most powerful sniper rifles in the world, and it was wrapped in official, tamper-evident seals stamped with serial numbers. She didn't look up when Thorne entered. Colonel, her voice was quiet but carried an edge like a well-honed blade. Captain, Thorne pulled up a chair, sat down uninvited. 72 hours out. How are you feeling about the mission? Humanitarian extraction in hostile urban terrain with uncertain enemy strength and unclear rules of engagement. Kincaid set down a cleaning rod with precise care. I'm feeling like it has a high probability of going wrong, sir. Your assessment? If it does go wrong, you'll need Overwatch, someone who can provide accurate intelligence and cover withdrawal if necessary. She still hadn't looked at him. But my orders are observe only, do not engage. Those are your orders, Thorne agreed. Now she did look up, and her eyes were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and absolutely steady. I understand my orders, Colonel. They stared at each other for a long moment. Two veterans who had both learned that orders and right action weren't always the same thing. I'm positioning OP-7 at grid November Kilo 234-891, Thorne said quietly, approximately 2,100 meters from the center of Black Ridge. Good sight lines, good fields of fire if they were ever needed, which of course they won't be, since your orders are observe only. Kincaid's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. That's very specific positioning, sir. I believe in thorough planning, Captain. Thorne stood. You know what happens if you break that seal again? Yes, sir. Dishonorable discharge, loss of pension, possibly prison time. And you're still going on this mission? Kincaid looked back down at her rifle, hands resuming their careful work. Marines might need someone watching their backs, sir. Thorne studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. I'm not ordering you to disobey, Captain. I want to be absolutely clear about that, but I'm also not blind to what might become necessary. He paused at the door. Understand? Understood, sir. After he left, Kincaid sat alone with her rifle and the sealed case of ammunition beside it. She pulled open a drawer in the workbench and took out a photograph, edges worn from too much handling. It showed a man in marine dress blues standing with a young boy, maybe 6 years old. They were smiling in front of a modest house somewhere in Middle America. On the back, in careful handwriting, Sergeant Graham, Donovan, and Liam, first day of school. Thank you for giving us this, Captain K. One of 38. 3 years ago in Kandahar province, Elara Kincaid had been assigned to a peacekeeping observation post. Her orders had been explicit: observe and report. Do not engage. Wait for authorization. She had watched through her scope as enemy fighters surrounded a school where 38 children were sheltering, had sent reports up the chain of command, had waited for authorization while the fighters moved into position, weapons ready, preparing to breach the doors. And she had kept waiting as the authorization never came. As politicians and commanders debated rules of engagement and diplomatic complications, as seconds turned into minutes and the fighters reached the school entrance, then she had stopped waiting. 14 shots, 14 targets, 90 seconds. 38 children walked out of that school alive, and Captain Elara Kincaid had walked into a court-martial. The proceedings had been quiet, almost apologetic. Yes, she had saved children. Yes, the outcome was positive, but she had disobeyed direct orders. In a military organization, that could not stand. The case was eventually dismissed under pressure from public sympathy and media attention, but her career was effectively over. Reassigned to training duty, rifle sealed under official order, the message was clear: you will never deploy again. Except now, she was deploying, and someone had very carefully positioned her exactly 2,100 meters from a city where 540 Marines were about to walk into a trap. Kincaid set the photograph down and returned to her rifle, hands moving with the unconscious grace of 11 years' practice. 73 confirmed kills, each one a human life ended by her decision, her skill, her willingness to pull a trigger from distances that turned people into abstractions. But they weren't abstractions to her. She remembered every face she'd seen through her scope, every calculation of wind and distance and bullet drop, every moment of deciding that this person, right now, needed to die so that other people could live. The arithmetic of war, written in brass and blood. She finished reassembling the rifle, checked the action one final time, then carefully wrapped it in protective cloth. The seal remained intact. For now. Christmas Eve morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of weather that made everything sharp-edged and brittle. At 0600 hours, the Marines of 2nd Battalion, 7th Regiment began loading into vehicles, checking weapons, reviewing maps one final time. Callum Hendricks sat in the back of a transport truck, trying not to look as terrified as he felt. 19 years old, from a town in Idaho so small it barely worn to the post office. His father had been a Marine. His grandfather had been a Marine. Hendricks had grown up on stories of honor and duty and brotherhood. Nobody had mentioned that honor sometimes meant sitting in the back of a truck, headed toward a city full of people who wanted to kill you, wondering if you'd ever see home again. First deployment? The voice came from beside him. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holbrook, 42 years old, built like a fire hydrant with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Scared? Hendricks hesitated, then nodded. Good. Holbrook checked the chamber on his rifle with practiced ease. Means your brain is working. Fear keeps you alert. Just don't let it freeze you up when things get loud. How do you, how do you stop it from freezing you? Holbrook was quiet for a moment, staring at something beyond the truck's canvas cover. You remember why you're here, not the big reasons, the patriotic speeches, the small reasons. The guy next to you, the civilians were pulling out. You focus on doing your job so everyone goes home. He glanced at Hendricks. And you trust that somebody up the chain is watching your back. 2,000 meters away, Ilara Kincaid was climbing into position. OP-7 was a partially collapsed apartment building on the northern edge of Black Ridge. 7 stories of concrete and rebar that had taken artillery fire months earlier. The top floor was a maze of rubble and exposed rebar, offering dozens of sight lines across the city below. Kincaid moved through the ruins with the careful silence of a hunting cat, her ghillie suit breaking up her outline until she was just another piece of debris. She carried her rifle case, a pack with ammunition and supplies, and the cold certainty that this mission was going to go wrong. By 1600 hours, she was in position. The rifle came out of its case, still sealed. She set it carefully on a low wall, then began the methodical process of establishing her hide. Sandbags positioned for support, foam pad to lie on, water and rations within reach, rangefinder, spotting scope, weather station, all the tools of her trade arranged with surgical precision. Then she settled in to watch. Through her spotting scope, the city of Black Ridge spread out below like a three-dimensional map. She could see the Marines moving through the streets, establishing positions, beginning the process of locating and processing civilians for evacuation. Professional, organized, vulnerable. And she could see the enemy watching them. It was subtle at first, a curtain moving on a third-floor window where no civilians should be. A man on a rooftop with a radio, stepping back into shadow when a Marine patrol passed. The slow, careful repositioning of forces that suggested coordination and planning. Kincaid pulled out her range cards and began mapping everything she saw: potential machine gun positions, mortar launch sites, command and control locations. She encrypted the data and sent her first report at 1700 hours. The response came back: continue observation. By 1900 hours, the trap was obvious to anyone who knew how to read a battlefield. The enemy had let the Marines penetrate deep into the city, spreading out to cover multiple evacuation sites. Now they were methodically moving into position to close the circle. Kincaid sent another report, flagging the buildup as critical. Continue observation, no engagement authorized. She watched the sun set over Black Ridge, watched the city lights flicker on in buildings that still had power, watched the Marines settle into what they thought were secure positions. And at 2100 hours, she watched the ambush begin. The first indication was a flash from the old textile factory, followed by the distinctive sound of a heavy machine gun opening up. Then another from the water tower. Then mortars began falling, the dull crump of explosions echoing through the streets. Through her scope, Kincaid watched Marines scramble for cover, watched the careful organization dissolve into chaos as units found themselves pinned down and separated. Her finger rested beside the trigger guard, not on it, beside it. The radio crackled with encrypted traffic, Haleford's voice trying to coordinate scattered elements while requesting support. Other voices, young and scared, calling for medical evacuation, reporting casualties, asking for orders. Then she heard the exchange that changed everything. Viper 6 to Badger 6. We are combat ineffective. Multiple casualties. Ammunition at 40%. No safe extraction route. Request immediate close air support. A long pause. Viper 6, Badger 6. Air support is denied at this time. Political situation. Stand by for further instructions. Kincaid's jaw tightened. Sir, my Marines are dying. I need those birds now. Another pause. When Colonel Thorne spoke again, His voice carried the weight of a man being forced to deliver a death sentence. "Captain Haleford, you are not a priority tonight. Hold your position. That's an order." Silence on the radio. Then, quietly, barely audible, "Understood, sir." Kincaid shifted her scope, tracking movement on the far side of the city. A man in a dark coat stood at a fourth-floor window of the municipal building, radio in hand, gesturing to fighters below. She watched him for 30 seconds, noting the way others responded to his commands. Enemy commander, the keystone of the entire operation. Remove him and the coordination would collapse, giving the Marines a chance to consolidate and defend. One shot. Her hand moved toward the seal on her rifle, fingers hovering millimeters from the tamper-evident plastic. Then she stopped. Because 3 years ago she had made this choice in the heat of the moment, driven by immediate necessity. 38 children about to die. No time to think, just act. This time was different. This time she had hours, not seconds. Time to understand exactly what she was choosing. Time to count the cost. Kincaid lowered her hand and pulled a photograph from her pack. Sergeant Graham Donovan and his son Liam, first day of school, smiling in the sunshine. One of the 38 she had saved at Kandahar. His letter had arrived last month, full of ordinary details about homework and soccer practice and the small miracles of watching a child grow. "Thank you for giving us this, Captain K." She had given them Sergeant Donovan's life, and it had cost her everything. Career, reputation, future, all sacrificed because she couldn't watch children die when she had the power to stop it. And now she was watching Marines die, 540 of them, trapped in a kill zone because some diplomat had decided their lives were less important than ceasefire optics. Young men like Callum Hendricks, 19 years old from small-town Idaho, fathers like the ones in Sergeant Donovan's photograph, sons and brothers and husbands who had families waiting at home, families who would get folded flags and empty promises instead of the people they loved. Through her scope, Kincaid watched the machine gunner on the textile factory roof fire another burst, watched a Marine fall, watched another drag him toward cover, watched blood darken the snow. The radio crackled again. This time it was a different voice, younger, breaking with stress. "Medic! Medic! Oh God, please, I need a medic here." It sounded like Hendricks. Kincaid's hand moved back toward the seal, trembling now, not with fear, with the weight of understanding exactly what she was about to do. At Kandahar, the court-martial had been sympathetic. Public opinion had been on her side. Children were innocent, the outcome was positive, and even the judge had seemed reluctant to punish her. This time would be different. This time she would be breaking the seal after explicit warning. This time there would be no public sympathy, no media pressure, no second chances. Dishonorable discharge, loss of pension, possible prison time. Every bridge burned, every door closed. And Colonel Thorne couldn't protect her. He had positioned her here, had given her access to command frequency, had made it possible for her to act. But if she pulled this trigger, he would have to disavow her. Plausible deniability. The colonel following proper procedure. The rogue captain disobeying orders. She would be completely alone. The church bell rang, that broken, discordant sound echoing across the city, marking time, counting down the minutes until Christmas Day that 540 Marines might never reach. Kincaid stared at the seal on her rifle, at the photograph in her other hand, at the scope showing her young men dying in the snow. She thought about Sergeant Donovan's son, starting first grade, doing homework, playing soccer, living a life that existed because one woman had decided orders mattered less than lives. She thought about the 540 Marines in Black Ridge and the families waiting for them at home, the children who might never know their fathers, the parents who might bury their sons, the wives who might become widows. The arithmetic of war. 38 lives saved, one career destroyed. How many lives was a career worth? Elara Kincaid placed the photograph carefully back in her pack. She reached for the seal on her rifle, and she waited. Not yet. Not in the heat of the moment. Not driven by immediate emotion. She would watch. She would calculate. She would wait until she was absolutely certain this was necessary. Because if she was going to destroy her life a second time, she was going to make damn sure it counted. The minutes crawled past. The machine gunner on the textile factory killed his 8th Marine. Mortar rounds continued to fall. Helford tried desperately to coordinate scattered elements with failing communications and dwindling ammunition. And at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, 300 kilometers away, Colonel Victor Thorne stood in front of satellite displays showing 540 orange thermal signatures surrounded by a sea of red enemy positions. He knew exactly what he had done. Knew he had positioned Captain Kincaid with perfect sightlines and fed her encrypted intelligence about enemy positions. Knew he had given her command frequency access so she would hear every word of the orders abandoning those Marines. Knew he had carefully constructed a situation where the right person, with the right skills, would have the opportunity to make the right choice. And if she made it, he would have to destroy her to save himself. The mathematics of command. Sometimes you sacrifice the one to save the many. Sometimes you gave someone else the terrible burden of making the choice you couldn't make yourself. Thorne closed his eyes. "Come on, Frost," he whispered to the empty operations center. "Show them what you can do." Back in Black Ridge, the church bell rang again, and Elara Kincaid's hand finally closed around the seal. The plastic tore with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. Her career ended in that instant, every bridge burning, every door closing. The point of no return crossed with a sound like breaking bone. She pulled the rifle from its case and began her final preparations. Because 540 Marines were dying, and someone had to give a damn. The seal broke with a sound like a promise shattering. Elara Kincaid pulled the rifle from its case, the metal cold against her hands, even through her gloves. 11 years, 73 confirmed kills, thousands of hours of training, practice, calculation, all of it leading to this moment on a frozen rooftop on Christmas Eve, watching Marines die while politicians played their games in Geneva. She settled the rifle onto the sandbags, checked the bipod legs, adjusted for cant. The weapon was an extension of her body now, familiar as her own hands. Schmidt and Bender scope, 5 to 25 times magnification. She dialed it to maximum power, and the city below jumped into sharp focus. Through the scope, she could see individual faces, young men pressed against walls, fear written in every line of their bodies. The machine gunner on the textile factory roof, methodical and disciplined, firing controlled bursts and shifting position between volleys. Already responsible for 8 deaths that she had counted, maybe more. And in the municipal building, 4th floor northwest window, the enemy commander, tall man, approximately 45 years old, dark coat, moving with the confident authority of someone who knew he was winning. He held a radio in his right hand, gestured with it as he gave orders, stepped to the window every few minutes to observe his kill box with something approaching satisfaction. The keystone. Remove him and the entire operation would fracture. But first she needed to do what she had spent 11 years learning to do. Calculate. Kincaid pulled out her Kestrel weather meter, held it up to catch the wind. The small device fed her numbers that would determine whether 540 Marines lived or died. Temperature, minus 4.2 degrees Celsius. Barometric pressure, 1,021 millibars. Humidity, 76%. Wind, 12 knots steady, gusting to 15, quartering from the northeast. She watched the snow fall, noting how it drifted. Light precipitation, not enough to significantly affect trajectory. Visibility approximately 85%. Acceptable. The laser rangefinder gave her the number that mattered most, 2,087 meters. 2 kilometers and 87 meters between her muzzle and the target, between decision and consequence. She pulled out her data book, began the calculations that separated professionals from amateurs. At this range, with this caliber, in these conditions, the mathematics became complex enough that most people would need a computer. Kincaid had done it so many times, she could feel the numbers more than compute them. Bullet drop at 2,087 meters with .338 Lapua Magnum, 300 grain Berger OTM, approximately 14.8 meters. The bullet would arc through the air like a thrown stone, rising first as it left the barrel, then falling in a graceful parabola that required her to aim almost 15 meters above her target. Wind drift. 12-knot crosswind at this range would push the bullet roughly 1.2 meters to the right. But the wind wasn't steady. Those gusts to 15 meant she needed to account for variance. Watch for the moments when the air stilled. Coriolis effect. The Earth's rotation would deflect the bullet 0.3 mils to the right at this latitude. Most shooters forgot about Coriolis. Most shooters never made shots at distances where it mattered. Spin drift. The bullet's rotation would cause additional rightward drift, approximately 0.2 mils. Every factor stacking, compounding, turning what looked like a straight line into a three-dimensional problem of physics and probability. Temperature effect. The cold air was denser, would slow the bullet fractionally, add another 0.4 meters of drop. Kincaid's mind held all of it simultaneously, turning raw data into a firing solution with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this calculation hundreds of times. 47.2 mils of elevation, 2.1 mils right for wind and drift. She pulled a specific round from her ammunition case, hand-loaded 300 grain Berger OTM. She had loaded these rounds herself 6 months ago, each one weighed, measured, checked for imperfections. Muzzle velocity, 2,847 feet per second. Ballistic coefficient, 0.818. Under her headlamp, she examined the brass. No imperfections. Checked the bullet seating depth with calipers. Perfect. Examined the primer seating. Flush. This round would do what she needed it to do. She loaded it into the chamber with a smooth motion. Felt the bolt lock home. Now the rifle itself. Kincaid settled into prone position behind the weapon, feeling her body align with the earth. This was the intimacy of the sniper, becoming part of the landscape, part of the weapon, reducing human error to its absolute minimum. Bipod legs adjusted for the slight downward angle. Rear bag positioned to support the stock without muscle tension. Scope parallax focused at infinity. Her hands found their positions automatically. Support hand under the stock, trigger hand wrapped around the grip, finger resting beside the trigger guard. Not on the trigger. Not yet. Natural point of aim. She closed her eyes, took a breath, let it out, opened her eyes again. The crosshairs settled on her target without any muscular correction. Perfect. If she had to force the rifle on target, the shot would fail. The weapon had to want to point there, had to rest there naturally. She dialed her elevation turret, 47.2 mils. Counted each click, feeling them with her fingers. Then windage, 2.1 mils right. The mechanical precision of German engineering translating her calculations into scope adjustments that would bend reality to her will. Through the scope now, maximum magnification, the enemy commander's face was clear enough that she could see his expression. Younger than she had first estimated, maybe 40, neatly trimmed beard. He was talking on the radio, animated, gesturing, probably believing he was far enough from the fight to be safe. He was wrong. Kincaid's breathing slowed. This was the fundamental skill, the one that separated marksmen from true snipers. Respiratory control that would make a Buddhist monk jealous. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds pause. Her heart rate dropped, 60 beats per minute, 55, 50, 45. She could feel her pulse in her trigger finger, could time the natural pause between heartbeats. The commander stepped to the window, looked out over his kill zone, admiring his work. Down below, Marines were dying. Private Daniel Garrett, 20 years old from Montana. Corporal Maxwell Quinn, 23 from Wyoming. Names she would never know, faces she couldn't see from this distance. Lives ending because this man had decided 540 Americans were acceptable targets. Kincaid's crosshairs settled center mass. At this range, she needed margin for error. A headshot would be too precise, too dependent on perfect conditions. Center mass gave her the greatest probability of a hit, the largest target area to account for any miscalculation. The commander turned, presenting his left side to her. Perfect. She began her final breathing cycle. 4 seconds in, watching the crosshairs drift slightly with her chest expansion. 4 seconds hold, absolute stillness, waiting. 4 seconds out, feeling her body settle. The pause. The natural respiratory pause between breaths, where the body is completely still, where the diaphragm is relaxed, where even heartbeat seems to suspend. The moment when snipers make their magic. Kincaid's finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. Gentle pressure, increasing slowly. The trigger would break at approximately 3 pounds. She knew this trigger like she knew her own name, had fired this rifle so many times she could predict the breakpoint within ounces. Through her scope, the commander was motionless in the window, completely unaware that 2,087 meters away, a woman he would never meet was about to end his life. For those worth saving, Kincaid whispered, and pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked, recoiling against her shoulder with familiar force. She absorbed it through her body, maintaining position, keeping her eye to the scope. This was the mark of a professional, maintaining sight picture through recoil, watching the shot impact, ready to make immediate corrections if necessary. The muzzle flash lit up the snow around her for a fraction of a second. The sound would echo through the city, bouncing off buildings, making triangulation nearly impossible. They would know someone had fired. They would have no idea where. Through her scope, Kincaid watched the bullet's invisible path. She couldn't see the projectile itself, of course. No one could at this range. But she could visualize its trajectory, could track its theoretical position through the air. 2,847 feet per second, spinning at 180,000 rotations per minute, a tiny piece of copper and lead carrying 11 years of training and 540 lives worth of consequence. 1001. The bullet arced upward initially, fighting gravity, riding the barrel's twist. 1002. Passing through maximum ordinate, beginning its descent, wind pushing it fractionally right. 1003. Falling now, accelerating under gravity, the commander still motionless in the window. 1004. Impact. The 300-grain bullet struck the commander exactly where Kincaid had aimed. Left of the sternum, slightly off-center to account for wind drift. At 2,087 meters, the bullet had retained enough velocity to create catastrophic hydrostatic shock. The impact wasn't just a penetration, it was a transfer of kinetic energy that turned tissue into fluid, that created a temporary wound cavity larger than a softball. Through her scope, Kincaid watched the commander's body jerk violently, watched him thrown backward into the room as if struck by an invisible truck. He disappeared from view, already dead. His nervous system just hadn't received the message yet. She counted 3 seconds of absolute stillness. The city held its breath. Marines pinned down, enemy fighters in position, the broken church bell silent between its automated rings. Nothing moved. Then everything exploded. Kincaid shifted her scope, watching chaos ripple outward from the municipal building like a shockwave. Enemy fighters poured onto the 4th-floor balcony, shouting, pointing in every direction, weapons raised, but no clear target. The sound of her shot had bounced through the urban canyon, reflecting off concrete and steel, creating multiple phantom origins. They had no idea where the shot had come from, and more importantly, they had no idea if another round was already in flight, already traveling through the cold air toward the next target. Fear was contagious. Kincaid had learned that lesson over 73 confirmed kills. Courage could be maintained through discipline and leadership, but fear, real, visceral fear of invisible death, spread like wildfire through even professional fighters. The machine gunner on the textile factory, the one who had killed 8 Marines with methodical precision, abandoned his position and bolted for the stairwell. Others followed. Unit cohesion unraveled as individuals acted on their own survival instincts, scrambling for cover, shifting positions, fleeing imagined lines of fire. Inside the municipal building, someone was yelling orders. The voice carried authority but no coordination. Without the commander's centralized control, without his radio network and tactical overview, they were individual units acting independently, making mistakes. And Captain Owen Haleford was too good an officer to miss the opportunity. His voice cut across the Marine tactical net, sharp and clear. All Viper elements, enemy is disorganized. 2nd and 3rd platoon, bound to the church. 1st and 4th, lay down covering fire. Move now, move now, move now. Kincaid watched through her scope as the Marines responded, like a single organism. Despite being scattered, despite the casualties and chaos, they were still Marines, still trained for exactly this kind of moment. 2nd platoon broke from cover, moving in teams, weapons up. 3rd platoon provided suppressing fire, not aimed shots but volume, keeping enemy heads down. The wounded were dragged, carried, pulled through the snow toward consolidated positions. And 30 seconds after her first shot, Kincaid fired her second. A replacement gunner had taken position on the textile factory roof, trying to re-establish the killing field. But he was firing wildly, undisciplined, spraying rounds without the methodical precision of his predecessor. Fear made him sloppy. Kincaid tracked him for 10 seconds, watching his pattern. Then she calculated a shot designed not to kill, but to terrify. She aimed 18 inches to his right at the concrete wall beside his position. Adjusted for the shorter range, 1,347 meters. Dialed her scope, controlled her breathing, pressed the trigger. The round slammed into the wall with explosive force, concrete fragments and dust blasting outward like shrapnel. The gunner's face shredded with debris, he screamed and dove for cover, abandoning his weapon, hands pressed to his bleeding face. Through her scope, Kincaid allowed herself a cold smile. She didn't need to kill him. A terrified man running and screaming accomplished more than a silent corpse. His panic would spread, his fear would infect others, and the enemy would become convinced they were facing multiple snipers, not just one woman with one rifle. Over the next 20 minutes, Kincaid fired 4 more times, never targeting personnel directly after the commander, always suppression, always psychological warfare. A radio antenna on an enemy observation post shattered with a single round, severing their communications, adding to the confusion. A fuel drum near a staging area punctured, diesel spilling out. Not enough to ignite, not immediately dangerous, but creating a dramatic visual of vulnerability. An ammunition crate stacked behind cover, hit at an angle that sent rounds spilling across the ground, forcing the fighters to scramble away from what they thought might explode. A support beam on a fighting position struck to send vibrations through the structure, making the occupants fear collapse. Each shot carefully calculated to create maximum psychological impact with minimum actual violence. This was the art that separated good snipers from great ones, understanding that the fear of being shot was often more powerful than the shooting itself. By 22:30 hours, the Marines had consolidated into 2 hardened defensive positions, one inside the old church, where the broken bell still rang its discordant chime, another in a reinforced apartment block with overlapping fields of fire. Most of the wounded had been evacuated to these positions. Overlapping security established. What had been a scattered, dying force was now organized and defensible. The enemy, meanwhile, had pulled back to their perimeter, leaderless, confused, afraid to press forward against an invisible threat that could kill from impossible distances. Kincaid watched through her scope with grim satisfaction. 6 rounds fired, 1 kill, 5 suppression shots, complete battlefield transformation. Her radio, the one she had switched off hours ago, crackled to life on an emergency override frequency. Badger 6 to all stations. Unknown shooter has violated engagement protocols in Black Ridge sector. All observation posts report immediately. Repeat, all OPs report immediately. She stared at the radio for a moment, then picked it up and threw it off the roof. It tumbled through 7 stories of darkness and shattered on the rubble below. Protocol mattered less than making sure 540 Marines lived to see Christmas morning. Inside the church bell tower, Lieutenant Brennan Westbrook crouched in the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. 20 minutes ago, they had been preparing to die. Now they were organized, defended, with an enemy that seemed almost afraid to approach. "Lieutenant!" The voice came from below. Private Callum Hendricks, climbing up the ladder with something clutched in his hand. "Sir, you need to see this." Westbrook descended to the main level, where Hendricks knelt beside a pile of rubble, holding up a twisted shard of metal. "What is it?" Came from one of the rounds that hit nearby. Hendricks angled it toward the flashlight, pointing at the scoring marks along one edge. "Look at the rifling pattern. This isn't standard enemy ammunition." Westbrook took the fragment, his 3rd tour of duty giving him enough weapons knowledge to recognize what he was seeing. The scoring was tight, precise, characteristic of match-grade ammunition. "Precision rounds," he said quietly. "Probably .338 Lapua Magnum." "Exactly." Hendricks looked up at him with wide eyes. "Someone's covering us, sir. Someone with a serious rifle. Someone professional." Westbrook turned the fragment over in his hand, then moved to the shattered church window and stared out at the distant rooftops. Whoever had fired those shots had done so from at least 2 kilometers away, in the dark, in falling snow, with wind. That level of skill was military, had to be, but there were no sniper teams in this area of operations, no friendly forces positioned to provide overwatch, which meant someone was operating completely off the books. His radio crackled. Captain Haleford's voice, tired but controlled. "All Viper elements sit rep, casualties, and ammunition status." Westbrook keyed his mic. "Viper 2, we have consolidated in the church. 23 wounded, 4 critical but stable. Ammunition down to 30%. Other platoons reported similar numbers. Bad, but not catastrophic. Not anymore." Haleford's voice came back, and there was something in it now, a kind of wonder mixed with realization. "I've seen those shots too. Someone out there is covering us. I don't know who, and right now it doesn't matter. Be ready to exploit any opening we get." Westbrook looked down at the metal fragment in his hand, then out at the darkness where somewhere an invisible guardian was watching over them. "Roger that, sir. Standing by." Combat medic Nora Sullivan worked methodically through the wounded, her hands steady despite 14 hours without sleep. Sergeant Kyle Brennan lay on a church pew. The shrapnel wound in his thigh finally stabilized after she'd fought for an hour to save his leg. "You're going to make it, Sergeant," she said quietly, adjusting his IV. "Going to walk your daughter down the aisle someday." Brennan managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Doc. Didn't think we'd see morning." "Someone out there made sure you would." Sullivan glanced toward the shattered window, toward the distant rooftops. "Someone who decided we were worth saving." Over the next hour, the mysterious sniper continued shaping the battlefield without killing anyone else. Rounds snapped past enemy positions just close enough to force them into cover. Equipment was destroyed, sight lines were denied, and slowly, methodically, The enemy's will to fight eroded under the psychological pressure of facing an opponent they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight. At Forward Operating Base Sentinel, 300 kilometers away, Colonel Victor Thorne stood before the satellite displays with his face carved from stone. "Show me the footage again," he said to Major Elena Vickers. The replay showed thermal imagery of the Black Ridge sector. At 22:29 hours, a single bright flash from a rooftop 2.1 kilometers north of the city center. 3 seconds later, the enemy commander's thermal signature went dark. Then 4 more flashes over the next 20 minutes, each one corresponding to enemy positions suddenly going cold or scattering. "Analysis?" Thorne asked, though he already knew the answer. Vickers pulled up the technical assessment. "Precision rifle fire, likely .338 or .300 Winchester Magnum. Shooter demonstrates skill beyond standard military sniper qualification. Night conditions, snow, wind, ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. This is expert-level marksmanship, sir." "Designated marksman accounted for?" "All friendly sniper teams are accounted for and in compliance with engagement restrictions." Vickers hesitated. "Sir, there's one observation post in that sector, OP-7, approximately 2.3 kilometers from the firing position." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Man by?" "Captain Elara Kincaid." Vickers pulled up her file on the adjacent screen. "Court-martialed 3 years ago for disobeying orders during the Kandahar school siege. Rifle was issued to her under official seal with strict instructions not to engage." She paused, highlighting another data point. "Sir, we lost contact with OP-7 at 22:25 hours, 4 minutes before the first shot." The name hung in the air between them. Everyone in the operations center knew the story. The sniper who had saved children and destroyed her career. The legend called Frost. And now she had done it again. "Sir," Vickers said carefully, "Ambassador Thornton is demanding to speak with you immediately." Thorne closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Bring him here." 10 minutes later, Ambassador Richard Thornton stood in the Tactical Operations Center, visibly irritated at being summoned from his quarters. He was a tall man in his 60s, wearing a suit that looked absurd in a military operations room, carrying himself with the particular arrogance of someone who believed diplomacy trumped everything. "Colonel Thorne, this had better be—" "Someone shot the enemy commander in Black Ridge," Thorne said, cutting him off. His voice was flat, factual, carrying no inflection. "Precision rifle shot from approximately 2,100 meters. We believe Captain Elara Kincaid acted against direct orders." Thornton's expression shifted from irritation to calculation in an instant. "Then she should be arrested immediately, court-martialed. This level of insubordination cannot be tolerated, especially with ceasefire talks. She saved 540 Marines." Thornton's eyes hardened. "She violated orders during a critical diplomatic window. Russian media is already claiming American escalation. If it becomes public knowledge that an American sniper killed an enemy commander on Christmas Eve, it will destroy 6 months of negotiations." "Those Marines are alive because of her," Thorne said. "Those Marines," Thornton replied coldly, "were going to be extracted at 0800 through negotiated withdrawal. I had been prepared to authorize it. Captain Kincaid's interference may have destroyed that option entirely." He stepped closer to Thorne, lowering his voice to something like a hiss. "I want her arrested quietly, immediately, before this becomes an international incident. Do you understand me, Colonel?" Something happened in that moment that would end Victor Thorne's career, but save his soul. 38 years of service, 38 years of following orders, maintaining discipline, respecting the chain of command, watching young men die in Desert Storm because politicians changed the rules, watching Rangers bleed out in Somalia because of restrictive engagement policies, watching good soldiers sacrifice their lives for diplomatic convenience in Iraq and Afghanistan, always obeying, always following procedure, always putting duty above conscience. Not tonight. No, Thorne said. Thornton blinked. Excuse me? I said no, Ambassador. I will not arrest Captain Kincaid for saving American lives. Colonel, you are making a serious mistake. I've made plenty of mistakes tonight, Thorne said, and his voice carried a weight that made even Thornton step back. But this will not be one of them. He turned to Major Vickers. I want a full report on my desk in 2 hours. Ballistics analysis, casualty projections with and without Captain Kincaid's intervention. Complete timeline of command decisions made tonight. Send it to the Commandant, the Secretary of Defense, and the Armed Services Committee. Sir, Vickers said carefully, that information is classified. Declassify it. I want sunlight on every choice made tonight, every order given, every life that was deemed expendable for Geneva optics. Thornton's face had gone red. You're ending your career, Colonel. Yes, Thorne agreed. I am. But at least I'll know I didn't abandon my Marines when it mattered. He looked at Thornton with something approaching contempt. Can you say the same, Ambassador? Thornton stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. After he left, Vickers approached Thorne quietly. Sir, that was career suicide. I know, Major. Thorne's eyes returned to the thermal display, to the 540 orange signatures still holding position in Blackridge, alive against all probability. But those kids deserve better than being sacrificed for a photo opportunity. And Captain Kincaid deserved better than being thrown to the wolves for doing the right thing. He pulled up a secure communication line to Captain Haleford. Get me Viper 6. It's time he knew the truth about what happened tonight, and about the guardian angel who just destroyed her career to save his Marines. Vickers watched him for a moment, then said quietly, For what it's worth, sir, I agree with what you did. Thorne nodded, but didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in it, just the grim certainty that sometimes the right thing and the lawful thing weren't the same, and you had to choose which kind of officer you wanted to be. He had made his choice. On the rooftop in Black Ridge, Elara Kincaid had made hers as well. She sat with her back against the low wall, rifle resting across her knees, watching the city through the falling snow. 6 rounds fired. 6 pieces of brass lying in the snow around her position, cooling in the winter air. The Marines were consolidating now, establishing real defensive positions, treating their wounded. The enemy had pulled back, leaderless and afraid. The immediate crisis was over, and her career was finished. Again. But 540 Marines would see Christmas morning, would go home to their families, would live lives that might have ended tonight in the snow and darkness. The arithmetic of war had always been brutal. 1 life for 38 at Kandahar, 1 career for 540 lives at Black Ridge. Kincaid pulled out the photograph of Sergeant Donovan and his son, studied it in the dim light. Somewhere in America, that boy was probably asleep, dreaming of Christmas morning, completely unaware that his father was alive because a stranger had sacrificed everything 3 years ago. And somewhere tonight, 540 families would have their sons and fathers and brothers come home because she had made the same choice again. She carefully put the photograph away, began packing her equipment with methodical precision. The military police would come eventually. There would be another court-martial, another end. But not yet. Not while Marines were still in danger. Her radio crackled one final time. Emergency override frequency. OP7, this is Badger 6 actual. Colonel Thorne's voice. Direct, unencrypted. He didn't care anymore who heard. Kincaid hesitated, then keyed her mic. Badger 6, OP7, send traffic. A long pause, then. Mission complete, Captain. Well done. For what it's worth, I'm proud to have served with you. Kincaid felt something catch in her throat. The colonel was ending his career too. Had to be. Nobody defied ambassadors and survived. Honor was mine, sir. Kincaid, out. She switched the radio off for the last time. The church bell rang again, that broken sound echoing through the darkness. But somehow it didn't sound quite as discordant anymore. Just different. Changed. Like everything else tonight. Kincaid settled in to watch over her Marines until dawn, one hand resting on her rifle, ready to fire again if needed. 6 rounds, 1 kill, 540 souls saved. The arithmetic worked. Dawn broke over Black Ridge at 0647 hours, the sky transforming from black to charcoal to slate gray and finally to the pale blue of winter morning. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving the city covered in a pristine blanket that almost made the destruction look peaceful. Almost. Captain Owen Haleford stood in the doorway of the church, watching his breath fog the freezing air, and tried to understand how they were still alive. Behind him, the church had become a makeshift aid station and command post. Wounded Marines lay on pews that had somehow survived the shelling. Combat medic Nora Sullivan moved between them with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had been working without sleep for 14 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holbrook coordinated security positions, his gruff voice carrying the reassuring authority that kept young Marines focused on their jobs instead of their fear. And throughout the long night, not a single additional Marine had died. Lieutenant Brennan Westbrook approached with a clipboard, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes clear. He had that particular look of someone who had expected to die and was still processing the fact that he hadn't. "Final count, sir." He handed the clipboard to Haleford. Owen Haleford read the numbers twice, unable to quite believe them. 540 Marines accounted for, 28 wounded, 4 critical but stable, and the number that made his chest tighten, 12 killed in action. 12. Not the 30% casualties that every tactical assessment had predicted. Not the 50% that had seemed inevitable when they were scattered and surrounded with no hope of extraction. 12 Marines had died, and every single one of them had fallen before 2,229 hours last night, before someone on a distant rooftop had fired a single shot and changed everything. "The enemy?" Haleford asked quietly. "Pulled back completely around 0300, sir. They're still out there, still have the perimeter, but they're not pressing. Command has authorized negotiated withdrawal to the northern extraction point. Enemy commander's replacement has agreed to allow movement without interference." Haleford looked out at the ruined city, at the broken buildings and shattered streets where his Marines had fought for their lives. Somewhere out there, invisible and unknown, was the person who had saved them all. "The sniper," he said. "Any confirmation?" Westbrook pulled something from his pocket. A spent cartridge casing, polished to a mirror shine. Someone had found it on a rooftop about a kilometer from their position, probably dropped when the shooter repositioned. Engraved on the base were coordinates and an inscription. "For those worth saving, EK." "EK," Haleford said softly. "Ilara Kincaid. Has to be." "Frost," Westbrook confirmed. "Staff Sergeant Holbrook says the instructors at Quantico talk about her. Says she's the best sniper the Corps has ever produced. The only one who could make shots like we saw last night." Haleford turned the casing over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. Such a small thing. A piece of brass that had once held a bullet. That bullet traveling over 2 kilometers through darkness and snow to kill one man and save 540. "She risked everything," he said, "for us, for strangers she'll never meet." "Yes, sir." Westbrook hesitated. "Permission to speak freely?" "Granted. We need to make sure every Marine in this battalion knows what she did. When we get home, when this is declassified or leaked or whatever happens, we need people to understand that someone cared enough to give up everything when our own command was ready to write us off." Haleford nodded slowly. Behind them in the church, someone had started singing. Quietly at first, just one voice, cracked and tired. "Silent night, holy night." Another voice joined, then another. Soon the entire church was filled with the sound of exhausted Marines singing a Christmas carol in a war zone. their voices rough and imperfect, and absolutely sincere. All is calm, all is bright. Nora Sullivan knelt beside Sergeant Kyle Brennan, the man she had fought all night to keep alive, watching him breathe steadily now, stable. Tears ran down her face as she sang, "Sleep in heavenly peace." Private Callum Hendricks stood by a shattered window, rifle ready, voice breaking as he sang the words his mother had taught him as a child. 19 years old from small-town Idaho, alive on Christmas morning when he had been certain he would die. Sleep in heavenly peace. Halford felt his own throat tighten, felt the sting of tears he refused to let fall. These were his Marines, his responsibility, and someone he had never met had made sure he could bring them home. He carefully put the cartridge casing in his pocket, then turned to address the assembled battalion. "Listen up!" His voice cut through the singing, bringing silence. "I want you all to hear something. Last night, a woman named Captain Ilara Kincaid sat on a rooftop 2 kilometers away and watched us dying. She had explicit orders not to engage. Her rifle was under official seal. Breaking that seal meant the end of her career, loss of pension, possible prison time." He paused, letting that sink in. She broke it anyway. One shot killed the enemy commander and collapsed their coordination. 5 more shots kept them scattered and afraid. She gave us the window we needed to consolidate, to survive, to see this morning. The church was absolutely silent now. When we get home, I want every man and woman in this battalion to know her name, to understand what she sacrificed for us. We were left for dead last night. Captain Kincaid refused to accept it. He pulled out the casing, held it up so they could all see. "For those worth saving." That's what she engraved on this. That's what she believed we were, even when our own command didn't. So when you go home to your families, when you hold your children or kiss your wives or hug your parents, I want you to remember that you're alive because one person had the moral courage to do what was right instead of what was ordered. Silence. Then Staff Sergeant Holbrook's gruff voice, "Hoorah, Captain Kincaid." The response came like thunder. 540 Marines, exhausted and wounded and alive, shouting in unison, "Hoorah!" The sound echoed through the ruined church, through the broken city, carrying across the snow-covered streets like a prayer of thanks to a guardian angel they would never meet. By 0800 hours, the negotiated withdrawal was underway. The enemy commander's replacement, a nervous man who had spent the night convinced he might be the next target of an invisible sniper, had been eager to agree to safe passage. The Marines moved in tight formation, weapons ready, eyes scanning, but encountered no resistance. The enemy watched from distant windows and rooftops, but nobody fired. The myth of the ghost sniper had grown throughout the night. Some claimed she had killed a dozen men. Others swore she could shoot through walls. A few insisted she was wounded, but still fighting. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that every fighter who might have contested the withdrawal was too afraid to risk becoming the next demonstration of her skill. The extraction took 3 hours. Wounded were loaded onto vehicles first, then the security elements collapsed inward in organized stages. By 1,000 hours, the last Marine was boarding the transports. Halford took one final look at Black Ridge, at the church with its broken bell, at the snow-covered streets where 12 of his Marines had died and 528 had lived, at the distant rooftops where somewhere, maybe still watching, was the woman who had made that ratio possible. "Thank you, Frost," he whispered to the frozen city, "wherever you are." Then he climbed aboard and left the place where 540 souls had been left for dead and somehow, impossibly, survived. At Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Captain Ilara Kincaid sat in a military police holding cell, hands folded in her lap, face calm. The cell was small but clean. A bunk, a sink, a toilet. She had slept in worse places on deployment. Through the small window, she could see Christmas lights strung up around the base, decorations that seemed absurd in a war zone, but somehow necessary. Reminders that somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the violence and politics and sacrifice, normal life continued. She had returned from OP7 at 0900 hours, walking directly to the provost marshal's office and turning herself in. No excuses, no explanations, just a formal statement that she had violated direct orders, broken the official seal on her rifle, and engaged enemy forces during a diplomatic ceasefire window. The MPs had been almost apologetic as they processed her. Everyone on the base had heard what happened. Everyone knew 540 Marines had come home because of what she did. But rules were rules, and Alara Kincaid had broken them. At 1400 hours, the door opened. Colonel Victor Thorne entered alone, closing it behind him. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. The lines on his face seemed deeper, cut by something beyond mere time. "Colonel," Kincaid stood automatically. "Captain, at ease. Sit." They sat across from each other in the small cell. Two soldiers who had both made choices that would end their careers. "Do you understand what you've done?" Thorne asked. "Yes, sir. I violated direct orders, broke the official seal on an issued weapon, engaged enemy forces during a diplomatic ceasefire window, disobeyed lawful commands from a superior officer. You saved 540 Marines. I did my job, sir." Thorne was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he said, "I knew what you'd do. From the moment I positioned you there, gave you that frequency access, I knew, and I let it happen anyway." Kincaid met his eyes. "You couldn't order it, but you could make it possible." "Yes," his voice was heavy. "I'm sorry, Captain. I used your conscience as a weapon." "Why?" "Because I'm 62 years old, served 38 years, Desert Storm, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every conflict, same pattern. Good soldiers dying for bad politics. Rules of engagement that protect diplomats instead of troops. Always following orders. Always obeying." His jaw tightened. "I'm old enough not to care about stars anymore, but those 540 Marines deserve someone willing to fight the system for them. And you chose me because I already proved I would sacrifice my career for what's right. At Kandahar, you saved 38 children and got court-martialed. You proved you have the moral courage most of us lack. I knew if anyone would make the hard choice when it mattered, it would be you." Kincaid sat back, processing this. The colonel hadn't just positioned her, he had orchestrated the entire situation, given her the tools, the information, the opportunity, then stepped back and let her make the decision that would destroy them both. "What happens now?" she asked. "Ambassador Thornton wanted you arrested, court-martialed, imprisoned. I refused. Told him I'd make every decision from last night public record." Thorne's voice was matter-of-fact. "I'm retiring in 90 days. They offered me brigadier general. I declined." "Sir, your career is over. Has been since I told an ambassador to go to hell." He almost smiled. "But here's what will happen for you. The official report will attribute the enemy collapse to internal leadership failure and adverse conditions. Your rifle's broken seal will be lost in combat damage documentation. You'll receive a medical discharge for PTSD within 6 months. Full benefits, honorable record, pension protected. You're protecting me. I'm protecting a Marine who made the hard call when it mattered. Anyone who tries to come after you will have to walk through a paper trail that makes them look monstrous. I've documented everything, every order that abandoned those Marines, every political calculation that valued Geneva optics over American lives." Thorne stood, and Kincaid stood with him. "You're the finest sniper I've ever known, Captain. Not because of 73 confirmed kills, because you know when not to pull the trigger and when you absolutely must. At Kandahar, you chose children over career. At Black Ridge, you chose Marines over freedom. That's not just skill, that's character." Kincaid felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, sir, for everything, for trusting me." Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a bronze star, the ribbon slightly faded. Earned this in Desert Storm. Want you to have it. Unofficial. Between us. You'll never get the medals you deserve for last night, but you'll have mine. Sir, I can't. Not asking, Captain. Giving. From one soldier to another who knows that orders aren't always right and conscience isn't always wrong. He placed the box on the table between them, then came to attention and saluted. Kincaid returned the salute, holding it longer than regulation, feeling the weight of everything that salute represented. When Thorne left, she sat alone with the medal, turning the box over in her hands. Through the window, Christmas lights blinked against the gathering darkness. She had saved 540 lives and lost her career. Again. The arithmetic still worked. 6 months later, the official records told a very different story than the truth. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines had completed a successful civilian evacuation from Black Ridge with casualties within acceptable parameters. The enemy collapse was attributed to internal command failure, exacerbated by adverse weather conditions. The ceasefire negotiations in Geneva had proceeded without incident. Colonel Victor Thorne retired with full honors, quietly declining the promotion to brigadier general that would have been automatic. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, simply returned to a ranch in Montana and disappeared from military circles. Captain Elara Kincaid received a medical discharge for post-traumatic stress disorder under honorable conditions. Full benefits, pension intact, record showing 11 years of distinguished service. She vanished completely from public view. But within the Marine Corps, the truth spread like wildfire. Bar to bar, from Camp Pendleton to Quantico to Lejeune, the story passed from veteran to veteran. 540 Marines left behind on Christmas Eve. Female sniper defying orders to save them all. One shot, 2 kilometers, middle of a snowstorm. Career destroyed, never complained. The details grew with each telling. Some swore she fired one-eyed. Others claimed she was wounded, but kept fighting. A few insisted she dropped a dozen enemies with perfect headshots. But the heart of the story never changed. One person risked everything when it mattered most. And in 2nd Battalion, a tradition began that would last for decades. Every Christmas Eve, wherever they were in the world, the Marines who had been in Black Ridge gathered. Some were still serving, deployed to Afghanistan or Japan or Korea. Others had returned to civilian life, to families and jobs and the ordinary miracle of growing old. But on Christmas Eve, they gathered. They laid 540 playing cards face up on whatever table they could find. Bar top, dining room, mess hall, it didn't matter. The cards represented each life that had been saved, and in the center they placed a single .338 Lapua Magnum cartridge casing, polished to a mirror shine. For those worth saving, no speeches, no ceremony, just silent recognition of the woman who had become a legend. Owen Haleford, promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of his own battalion, kept the original casing in a shadow box in his office. Next to it hung a photograph taken on Christmas morning in Black Ridge. 540 Marines standing in front of the church, exhausted and wounded and alive. Brennan Westbrook became a sniper instructor at Quantico. Every class he told students about the impossible shot, the distance, the wind, the stakes, and he always ended the same way. Technical skill makes you good. Courage to pull the trigger when your career is on the line makes you a legend. On his classroom wall hung a photograph of Elara Kincaid in her official Marine portrait, young and serious and absolutely focused. Underneath a simple caption, "This is what a real warrior looks like." Callum Hendricks completed his enlistment and returned to Idaho, where he eventually became a college professor. The cartridge casing stayed in his wallet for 30 years. Every Veterans Day, he told his students the story. "I was 19 years old, terrified, certain I was going to die. A woman I never met gave up everything so I could come home. That's what service means. That's what sacrifice looks like. Nora Sullivan continued serving, eventually rising to colonel and running the Marine Corps Combat Medic School. She established an annual award named after Alara, the Kincaid Award for Moral Courage, given to the student who best demonstrated the willingness to make hard choices under pressure. Sometimes, she told each graduating class, the hero isn't the one with the medical bag. It's the person 2 kilometers away creating the space for you to work. Remember that. And slowly, over years, the legend of Frost spread beyond the Marines who had been there. New recruits heard the story during training. Officers studied it in tactical courses. The details might vary, but the core remained constant. 1 woman, 1 rifle, 1 night, 540 souls saved. 6 years after Black Ridge, on a cold Christmas Eve in the Colorado Rockies, Alara Kincaid sat on the porch of a remote cabin with a cup of coffee, watching snowfall on the peaks. She was 41 now, living as far from military life as geography and determination could manage. The cabin had no internet, no television, just a radio for weather reports and emergencies. She worked as a wilderness survival instructor for a veterans organization, teaching troubled former soldiers how to find peace in the silence of the mountains. She never spoke publicly about Black Ridge, never acknowledged the legend attached to her name. The journalists who occasionally found her were turned away politely but firmly. She had nothing to say that hadn't already been said by her actions. At exactly 2,229 hours, the time she had fired the shot that changed everything, headlights appeared on the mountain road. Alara watched the truck climb the steep grade, already knowing who it would be. The same visitor she received every Christmas Eve for the past 6 years. Colonel Victor Thorne, now 68 and officially retired, stepped out of the truck carrying a small package. His hair was white now, his movements slower, but his eyes were still sharp. They sat together on the porch without speaking, watching the snowfall. 2 soldiers who had ended their careers on the same night for the same reason and never regretted it. Got Christmas cards, Thorne said eventually. 540 of them this year. Alara raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to drive all the way up here to tell me that. Not for you, for me. Reminds me I did one thing right in 38 years. They watched the snow in silence for a while. Owen Haleford is lieutenant colonel now, Thorne continued. 3 kids, named his daughter Alara. Alara's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. Brennan Westbrook teaches your shot at Quantico, shows your photo to every class. Callum Hendricks became a professor, tells your story every Veterans Day. Nora Sullivan runs Combat Medic School, named an award after you. He let that settle, then added quietly, they remember, all 540, their families, children who wouldn't exist without what you did. Alara stared at her coffee. What we did, Victor. No, his voice was firm. I gave you the opportunity. You had the courage to take it. That's all you. He handed her the package. From 2nd Battalion, they wanted you to have this. Inside was a framed photograph. 540 Marines standing in front of the Black Ridge Church on Christmas morning. Exhausted, wounded, alive. Around the border, all 540 signatures. Thank you, Frost. We remember. Alara stared at the photograph, at all those faces, and for the first time in 6 years, tears ran down her cheeks. Silent, unstoppable, carrying 6 years of carefully maintained control, finally breaking. I didn't do it for thanks, she managed. I know, Thorne said gently. That's why they give it anyway. He stood to leave but hesitated at the truck. One more thing. Commandant called me last month, off the record. Said if you ever wanted to come back, teach at Quantico, train the next generation, doors open. No publicity, no official record. Just pass on what you know. Alara shook her head. That door closed twice, Victor. I'm done. Thorne nodded. Fair enough. But offer stands. Corps could use someone teaching them that orders aren't always right and conscience isn't always wrong. He climbed into his truck and drove away into the snow, taillights disappearing down the mountain. Ilara sat alone with the photograph, studying the faces of the 540 Marines she had saved. Young men and women, most barely adults, who had gone home to their families because she had made an impossible choice on a frozen rooftop. She thought about the 12 who had died before she could act, the ones she hadn't saved. Their names were carved into her memory as deeply as the 73 kills. Private Daniel Garrett, Corporal Maxwell Quinn, and 10 others whose deaths she had watched through her scope, helpless until she finally broke the seal. 12 losses, 528 saves. The arithmetic of war, written in lives instead of numbers. She stood and walked to the cabin window. Inside, covering one entire wall, were letters. Hundreds of them. Thank you notes from Marines, from their spouses, from their parents, from children born after Black Ridge who owed their existence to a shot fired on Christmas Eve. Letters she had kept but never answered. Because what could she say? You're welcome for destroying my career twice. You're welcome for doing what anyone with a conscience should have done. Through the window of her cabin, the letters created a mosaic of gratitude, each one a life touched by that single decision, each one a reminder that sometimes the hardest choices were also the most important. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the mountains in silence. And if you listened very carefully, beneath the wind and the soft hiss of snowflakes, you might hear a sound like a distant church bell, or maybe like a single rifle shot, echoing across 6 years and 2,087 meters, carrying with it the weight of 540 souls saved and 2 careers gladly sacrificed. Ilara Kincaid stood at her window, looking at the wall of letters, at the photograph of the Marines she would never meet, and thought about the question that had defined both court-martials. When orders and conscience conflict, which do you choose? She had answered that question twice. At Kandahar for 38 children, at Black Ridge for 540 Marines. She had lost her career twice, her pension once, her future both times, and she would make the same choice again tomorrow if she had to. Because in the end, she wasn't just a soldier following commands. She was a human being who refused to watch others die when she had the power to stop it. That was legacy enough. The snow fell. The mountains stood silent, and somewhere in America, 540 families sat down to Christmas dinner with people who shouldn't have been there, who should have died in a frozen city on Christmas Eve, who lived because one woman believed that orders mattered less than lives. The church bell in Black Ridge, repaired by local volunteers years ago, rang clear and strong every Christmas Eve at midnight. Marines who had been there swore you could hear it for miles. That perfect sound carrying across the winter darkness. And some insisted that in the silence between the chimes, if you listened very carefully, you could hear another sound, a single sharp crack echoing across the frozen city, the sound of one shot, one decision, 540 lives saved, for those worth saving.